My name is Chief Damien Okoye, and for 58 years I have carried my name like a crown, forged in sweat, sharpened by struggle, and polished by pride. I was not born into wealth. I clawed my way up from the red dust of Onitsha's main market, where boys hawked spare parts under the blazing sun. Every coin I made was a victory. Every insult I endured was fuel. From there I rose, to Lagos, to Abuja, to the corridors of power where men spoke in billions and moved nations with phone calls. Everything I did, every deal, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, was for one person, my son, Chuka. From the day he was born, I saw in him the heir I never was. I sent him to the best schools, gave him the childhood I could only dream of. When his mother, Amaka, left me years ago for another man, I vowed that Chuka would never feel abandoned the way I once did. I loved that boy with a devotion that bordered on blindness. And perhaps that was my first mistake, loving too much and watching too little. The first cracks in my empire appeared quietly. My accountant, a timid man who feared even his own shadow, came to me one evening with trembling hands and whispered that some minor discrepancies had been found in our books. I waved him off. Discrepancies happen, I said. Numbers lie, people make mistakes. But then came the second report, then the third. Small missing funds, strange authorizations, deals I never approved. I started noticing things that didn't add up. A project in Port Harcourt funded without my consent, an overseas transfer to an unfamiliar account. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. Chuka was in charge of the financial wing, my son, my blood. Surely he wouldn't do me harm. But fate has a way of forcing open your eyes when you refuse to see. The day the truth surfaced, the world seemed to pause, like a drumbeat suspended before a thunderclap. I was in my office at Okoye Holdings, signing a partnership deal with a South African firm, when my lawyer, Ifeanyi, stormed in with a face pale as ash. He placed a brown envelope on my desk. "Chief," he said, voice shaking, "we need to talk. Now." Inside were copies of documents, contracts, approvals, bank statements, all bearing my signature. Only they weren't mine. I felt my heart pound against my ribs. "What is this?" I asked. He swallowed. "Evidence of a financial misrepresentation, sir. The EFCC is already investigating. Someone leaked them to the press. Within hours, news channels were flashing my name across screens. Okoye Holdings under investigation for fraud. Renowned businessman accused of embezzlement." The media tore into me like vultures feasting on a carcass. And while I sat in shock, watching my life unravel on national television, my son, my Chuka, stood silently beside me, pretending to be the dutiful heir. He even gave interviews, talking about how he didn't know what went wrong, how his father's legacy was under threat. It was a performance so convincing that even I wanted to believe it, until the night I followed him. He didn't know I was there. He had gone to a private villa in Lekki, one I didn't recognize. I parked a few meters away, watching from the shadows. Through the large glass windows, I saw him enter, smiling. A woman emerged from the hallway, tall, elegant, wrapped in a silk robe. My breath caught in my chest. Amaka, my ex-wife. The woman who had left me 15 years earlier for a politician's promise. And there they were, my son and my ex-wife, sharing wine, laughing like partners in crime. I stayed in that car for hours, staring at them, my pulse a storm beneath my skin. Every memory of their betrayals merged into one bitter truth. They had done it together. Mother and son, Amaka and Chuka. The thought was so poisonous I almost gagged. When I confronted him the next morning, the sun had barely risen. He was sitting in my study, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. I shut the door behind me. "Where were you last night?" I asked. He looked up, confused. At home, of course. Don't lie to me, Chuka, I said, voice low but trembling. I saw you. You were with her. His expression changed. Not shock, not guilt, but a slow, cruel smirk. So you finally know, he said. My blood went cold. You? He stood, straightened his jacket, and looked at me like one looks at a dying man. Father, your time is over, he said softly. You built this empire for yourself, not for anyone else. I'm just taking what should have been mine. I stared at him, speechless. My hands trembled. What should have been yours? Everything I own, I built for you. He laughed, a hollow, mocking sound. No, you built it for your pride, for your name. You never saw me as your successor, just your shadow. The words pierced deeper than any blade could. And Amaka, I asked, you brought her into this? Your own mother? He shrugged. She understands me better than you ever did. That was when I realized I wasn't speaking to my son anymore. I was speaking to a stranger wearing his face. In the days that followed, the betrayal consumed me. Investors pulled out. My lawyers resigned. Even my board members, men I had fed for decades, turned their backs. Every night I sat alone in my mansion, staring at the walls lined with family photos. One in particular haunted me, a picture of Chuka at age 10, standing beside me at his first school prize-giving day, grinning proudly as I held his small hand. That boy. Where had he gone? My friends told me to fight back, to expose him. But I couldn't. How do you fight your own blood? How do you destroy the child you once carried in your arms? I went silent, stopped taking calls. The newspapers said I had fled the country. The truth was worse. I had retreated into myself. Every sound felt like a whisper of mockery. Every face reminded me of betrayal. Even my staff walked on eggshells, afraid to meet my eyes. One evening, my driver, old Musa, came to me hesitantly. Chief, he said, they are saying young Master Chuka is hosting a party tomorrow night. Big one. In the same hotel you used to own? That sentence struck me like lightning. The same hotel I built. So I went, not as a guest, as a ghost. From the corner of the crowded hall I watched him, laughing, shaking hands, surrounded by sycophants. The banner behind him read, Okoye Group, under new leadership. Under new leadership. My own son had stolen my company, my name and my legacy, and was now celebrating my burial while I still breathed. He raised a glass, speaking into the microphone. My father's era has ended. This is a new beginning. For me, for our family, for the future. The crowd cheered. Cameras flashed. And in that moment, something inside me died. Something tender. Something human. Because the man I had loved more than life itself was now standing on my grave, applauding his own victory. I left that night without saying a word. As the rain poured, I sat in my car watching the city lights blur through my windshield. My heart was heavy with 1,000 memories. His first steps, his laughter, the nights I carried him on my shoulders through power outages. But then, another voice whispered inside me, cold, sharp, and unyielding. You made him. You fed this monster. Now you must deal with him. It was the voice of reason, the voice of vengeance. And for the first time in my life, I listened. When I got home, I went to my study, the same room where my empire had once been planned, and opened the old chest my father left me. Inside were documents, deeds, and journals, the foundation of everything I'd ever built. I stared at them for a long time, then slowly closed the lid. There, in the silence of that midnight storm, I made a vow, not of forgiveness, not of surrender, but of reckoning. If Chuka wanted to play the game of power, I would show him how the real game was played. He thought he had destroyed me, but he had only awakened the man I used to be, the one who fought barefoot in the markets, the one who slept on benches just to save enough for his first container, the one who feared nothing, not even God's thunder. And so I rose from my chair, poured myself a drink, and whispered into the night, "My son, you may have taken everything I built, but you have no idea what I am still capable of." That was the night Chief Damien Okoye, the father, died, and Damien the Avenger was born. They say when a king falls, even the ground trembles in pity. But when I fell, the world laughed. The scandal hit the media like wildfire, spreading faster than truth could catch up. Every headline bore my name like a curse. Okoye Holdings in financial scandal. Chief Damien Okoye under investigation. Greed of a tycoon exposed. My phones rang until their batteries died. Friends, allies, journalists, vultures all circling for a bite of my carcass. The same men who once toasted to my success now distanced themselves, pretending they had never known me. Banks froze my accounts. Investors withdrew. Overnight, I went from being a titan to a cautionary tale. And there, on national television, stood Amaka, my ex-wife, weeping crocodile tears, painting herself as the wounded angel who had endured years of financial abuse from a controlling man. Beside her stood Chuka, my son, my blood, the architect of my downfall, with that smug little smirk, watching as his father's legacy burned to ashes. He had inherited my face, but none of my heart. He had my ambition, but twisted by arrogance. He had my intelligence, but poisoned by greed. The betrayal gnawed at me more than the scandal itself. Because I didn't just lose my wealth. I lost my peace, my purpose, my son. But I didn't beg. No, I refused to give them that pleasure. I watched. I waited. Weeks turned into months. My mansion became a tomb of silence. The servants left. The lights stayed off most nights. My once bustling driveway, where foreign cars once lined up for business meetings, was now covered in dust and dry leaves. People who used to greet me with "Chief, Chief," now crossed the street to avoid me. Even in church, the pastor's sermon changed tone whenever I entered. The same man who once called me pillar of the community now spoke of the dangers of pride. But I didn't speak. I kept my mouth shut and my eyes open. I knew Chuka. I had raised him. I understood his weaknesses, the hunger for validation, the reckless need to prove himself. I knew he couldn't handle success. He'd inherited an empire without earning it, and empires, like crowns, crush weak heads. So I waited for gravity to do its work. It was a rainy night when fate came knocking, literally. I was alone in my sitting room, nursing a cup of cold tea, when I heard a knock at the gate. Musa, my old driver, who still stayed with me out of loyalty, came running in. "Chief," he said, "there's a woman outside. She says she must see you." Now I hesitated. Then I heard her voice, trembling, familiar. "Please, Chief, it's me, Ijoma, my daughter-in-law." When she stepped in, I almost didn't recognize her. The glow she once carried, the quiet grace that used to light up every room, was gone. In its place was a woman broken by fear and exhaustion. Her once beautiful face was swollen, her lips split. "Good heavens," I whispered, "who did this to you?" She looked at me with red, tear-streaked eyes. "Your son." Those two words struck harder than a bullet. "Chuka," she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "He's not the man you think he is anymore, Chief. He drinks, he gambles, he brings women home in front of me, and when I protest, he hits me." My fists clenched. "He laid his hands on you." She nodded again, trembling. "I can't take it anymore. I want to leave, but he threatened to destroy me if I ever tried." I felt a storm rise inside me, not just of anger, but of shame. How had my own blood turned into such a monster? I stood there, pacing, trying to control my breath. She was crying, shaking, apologizing for even coming. But then she said something that changed everything. "Chief," she whispered, "I don't even think he loves me anymore. He's obsessed with power. He keeps saying he'll be greater than you ever were. Sometimes I think he hates you more than he loves himself." That night, something inside me cracked, because I realized I had raised not a son, but a mirror, and that mirror now reflected the ugliest parts of me. Over the next few weeks, Ijoma started visiting more often, under the pretext of needing advice or help with her children's school fees. At first, I saw her as a victim, a daughter who needed protection. But as the weeks passed, something darker brewed between us. Not love, not comfort, but a shared pain bound by betrayal. We both had scars carved by the same hand, Chuka's. She wanted freedom. I wanted revenge. Together, we found something dangerous, a purpose. One evening, she brought me Chuka's new business documents. "He's moving money," she said. "He's been using shell companies, buying fake assets. He's hiding the money he stole from you." I stared at the papers, feeling my pulse quicken. For months, I had felt powerless, a king without a throne. But in that moment, with those papers in my hands, I felt something awaken inside me. Something cold, calculating, and very much alive. I looked up at her. "You've done well, Ijoma. Leave the rest to me," she smiled faintly. "I just want peace, Chief." Peace. What a strange word for two people plotting ruin. With those documents, I began my quiet counterattack. I contacted old allies, men who still owed me loyalty, not out of friendship, but fear. I fed them bits of information about Chuka's business moves. Then I reached out to a few journalists, under an alias, leaking files that painted my son not as a visionary heir, but a reckless fraudster. I didn't need to fabricate anything. I simply let the truth breathe. And the truth, when freed, is more destructive than fire. Within months, whispers began to spread. Investors pulling out, banks questioning his assets, auditors sniffing around. Chuka started panicking. His arrogance turned to desperation. Meanwhile, Amaka, the great actress, began losing her shine. The media that once hailed her as a resilient woman now turned on her, questioning her lavish lifestyle, her offshore accounts. The same public that cheered my downfall now demanded hers. And I watched from the shadows, sipping tea, as their empire began to crack. But even as I plotted, I couldn't shake off the unease of what had blossomed between Ijoma and me. Every evening she came, bringing updates, sometimes staying long after midnight. We talked about life, regret, pain. She confessed how lonely she felt. I confessed how betrayed I was, two broken souls sharing the same wound. Then one night it happened, that moment where silence became louder than words. She reached for my hand, her eyes glistening. "You didn't deserve what he did," she whispered. And for a brief, damning moment, the line between father and daughter-in-law disappeared. What happened that night I will never justify, nor deny. It wasn't love. It wasn't lust. It was vengeance finding an echo in sorrow. And afterward, as she cried into her palms, whispering, "What have we done?" I had no answer, because I didn't know if I felt guilt or grim satisfaction. Days later, Chuka came to see me. He stormed into my compound unannounced, fury blazing in his eyes. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" he spat. "I know you're behind this. The leaks, the rumors. It's you, isn't it?" I leaned back in my chair, calm as a monk. "Chuka," I said, "you give me too much credit. I'm just an old man watching the world punish the ungrateful." He slammed his fists on my desk. "I'll destroy you, old man." "I swear I will." I smiled faintly. "You already tried. Look around you. You destroyed everything you could, and yet, here I am, breathing, waiting." He stormed out, cursing, leaving a trail of rage behind him. As his car sped off, Ijoma stepped out from the hallway where she had been hiding. Her hands were shaking. "He knows," she whispered. I looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "Let him know." Some truths burn slow. By the end of that year, the cracks became chasms. Chuka's companies were in debt. His partners fled. His accounts were frozen. And when the government finally reopened investigations, the evidence I'd quietly planted ensured he took the fall. The irony was poetic. The son who once framed his father for fraud was now being investigated for the same crime. Meanwhile, Amaka fled to London, claiming mental stress. The last I heard, she was living off what little remained of her beauty. As for Chuka, his empire was collapsing, brick by brick, just as he had done to mine. And I watched quietly, almost serenely. But revenge, I've learned, is not victory. It's a hunger that never ends. Because even as Ijoma sat beside me some nights, silent and guilt-ridden, I could feel the weight of what we had done. Not just to him, but to ourselves. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. By the time the first quarter of the next year came, I had regained my power, not through wealth or reputation, but through control. I had my grip back on fate. I was no longer the victim, but my soul was no longer clean. I stood one evening on my balcony, watching the sun set over the same city that once worshipped me, and whispered to myself, "It's not business I rebuild now, it's ruin." And as the wind carried my words into the darkening sky, I knew Act 3 of my story was about to begin. Because Chief Damien Okoye was done waiting, it was time for the reckoning. They call vengeance a blunt instrument. They are wrong. Vengeance, when done right, is a scalpel, precise, patient, surgical. I learned that lesson the way all old men learn the hard truths, through blood and time. After Act 2, I did not rush. Fury is loud, wisdom is quiet. I sat in the ruins of my life and listened to gossip, to market movements, to the softest creaks of fear in men who once pretended to own me. I had been stripped of wealth, but not of memories, not of contacts, not of the debt of favors accrued across decades. Those debts were the ledger I opened slowly. The long game is boring for the impatient. You lose the pleasure of instant satisfaction, but you gain something infinitely more powerful, inevitability. I wrote letters that said nothing and everything. I placed calls that seemed accidental. I let rumors be seeds sown in the right soil. I found auditors with hungry consciences, lawyers with debts to settle, journalists who liked scoops more than truth. I fed them breadcrumbs, a date, a transfer, a name. Small things, plausible things, things that smelled faintly of truth. And Chuka, pride swelling like a blister, pricked himself on those crumbs. First came the diversions, deliberate, petty, but effective. I leaked a file suggesting a questionable overseas purchase by one of Chuka's shell companies. He approved another deal in a hurry, eager to show momentum. I fed the transaction to a trusted ally at the bank. He watched the ledger, pretended to miss a red flag, then flagged it to regulators when the second, third, and fourth suspicious transfers followed. An audit that might once have been a skirmish turned into a siege. By design, I made him the businessman who panicked. Investors hate panic. Partners vanish at the first gust of it. It is a natural law in my world. Confidence collapses faster than concrete under a sledgehammer. Amaka's fall was artful and inevitable. I did not need to invent her faults. Greed writes its own obituary. Rumors I seeded were grafted onto true whispers. Offshore accounts she'd mentioned in the wrong room. Lavish payments that could no longer be explained. I let the press do what it does best. amplify a scandal until the social pressure suffocated the facts. Within weeks, the cars were gone, documents were seized. Her name, once a shrewd brand, became a footnote in gossip columns. She sold whatever dignity remained and fled to a different climate. London suited well for washed reputations. Chuka tried to salvage what remained with bluster and expensive lawyers, but the cracks spread like a contagion. Creditors who had once courted him now sent legal notices. Board members who had sat in his hotel suite and toasted his future turned their faces when subpoenas arrived. Lawsuits arrived, at first tentative, then vindictive. Contracts vanished under the weight of clauses and fine print he had never bothered to read. Liability accumulated like rotting fruit, pungent, visible, and impossible to ignore. I watched from a distance as his empire, the one he had rebuilt from the ashes I'd created, staggered. I did not gloat. Satisfaction tastes hollow when it is merely personal. My joy, when it came, was not at his ruin, but at the restoration of order. What he had stolen was not mine alone. It was a structure of trust, employment, and reputation that fed hundreds. He had treated it like a toy. He had burned what others relied upon. So my revenge was not merely vindictive, it was corrective. There were nights I lay awake thinking of the moment he had faced me and declared my time over. The memory of his voice, so sure and terrifying then, became the metronome of my patience. I plotted scenes in which he would feel the weight of consequence the way I had felt it. Not charismatic, but crushingly ordinary. The mail piling up with delinquencies, the cars repossessed, the school fees unpaid. I wanted him to learn that hunger is a lesson no man should teach another without suffering it himself. One spring afternoon, when the Abuha rains had thinned and the sun sat high like an impartial judge, I stood outside the mansion he had bought with my money. A grotesque monument to ill-gotten entitlement, all glass and bravado. The gate opened with the same pomp it had always had. Men in crisp shirts moved like insects. A child's shout echoed from an upstairs balcony. A dog barked. Life went on inside. He saw me from the driveway and froze. He came running out barefoot, the image of panic. His pajama pants stained, hair falling into his eyes. The man reduced from predator to pleading creature. For a second I saw the boy he'd been, the small hands I once held. The second after that, the bitter truth. He was still the man who had smiled as I drowned. "Father, please, stop this. I can fix it. Just stop." His voice cracked between command and entreaty. Pride and fear waged war in him. It was an ugly sight. I did not move to comfort him. Sympathy would undo the lesson. Instead, I walked slowly toward him, my cane clicking against the driveway, an absurdly theatrical sound in that moment. The crowd at the gate turned to watch the unfolding scene, the ruined patriarch and his son, the prodigal and the accused. I stopped a few paces away and looked at him with a coldness that surprised even me. My face did not move much. I had learned that the most devastating words are often spoken with the quietest voice. "Son," I said, and the word hung between us heavy as an indictment. "You took my world." I just took it back. He fell to his knees as if struck. Tears poured from him, not the drying kind, but the messy, wet kind that stains a man's life. He begged, pleaded, cursed, a torrent of sound that meant nothing and everything. Those around him murmured. Some clapped, unsure whether for me or for the drama. Ijoma watched from the balcony above, a pale statue whose expression registered grief, relief, and something else unreadable. I did not gloat in the spectacle. I turned to the small crowd and spoke plainly, in a tone meant to be heard beyond the manicured hedges and the gossiping neighbors. "You built on my sweat and thought it yours. You acted without honor. You did not only steal money, you stole trust. You broke people. Remember them." Let this be a lesson, I spoke slowly as a teacher who has nothing left to prove. I gave you every chance to be a man. You chose to be a boy with dangerous toys. Later, alone with my thoughts, the truth settled. The revenge had been precise, but the cost was raw. Revenge does not stitch wounds, it cauterizes. There is a burn that does not heal into anything resembling peace. I had reclaimed property, reputation whispered back into pockets of influence, and yet something in me chalked a tally that nothing could erase. Quiet consequences built a house in the hollow place of my chest. In the weeks after that scene, the legal machinery did its slow, meticulous work. Chuka's companies were dissected, offenses were catalogued. He was forced to sell what he could, one mansion, then another asset. Bankers removed him from directorships. Men who had once kissed his ring now refused his calls. Law is a cold instrument. It cuts without the melodrama of anger. It hums with paperwork and deadlines. And in its hum I heard the music of finality. Despite it all, I did visit him in the small, rented flat he moved into when the last lease expired. It was cramped, a room that smelled faintly of fried plantain and regret. He answered the door in a stained shirt, eyes rimmed red. His hands trembled as he poured me tea, an awkward attempt at hospitality between two men whose history was raw with betrayal. He started with apologies, first to me, then to himself. "I'm sorry, Father," he said. "I thought I was good enough. I thought I could fix what you built and do better." His voice had the smallness of a child begging forgiveness for a broken toy. "Tell me what to do. Tell me how to make this right." For a long time I looked at him and said nothing. The ache to forgive warred with the memory of every humiliation, every lie. I thought of Ijoma, of what she had endured to bring me the documents that began his undoing. I thought of the men whose livelihoods had been gambled away by his hubris. I thought of myself and the man I had become. "Make it right," I said eventually, "by starting with truth. Admit what you did, pay back what you can, and for God's sake learn humility." He nodded, a broken. "I will," he promised, but promises are fragile things in men who have known only the taste of taking. When I left his rented flat, I felt no satisfaction, no jubilation, only a tiredness that was part victory, part mourning. The avenger inside me had won the small battles, but the larger war, the war against emptiness, against the hollow ache that revenge cannot touch, remained. Outside, in the expanse of the city, life resumed. Markets reopened. Men made deals. The papers shifted to the next scandal. But the sound within my chest had changed. Where once there had been only the desire to correct, now a quieter thing grew. The wish to rebuild without the bitterness that had hollowed me. I did not believe I could ever be the same man who had been blinded by the love of an empire. Perhaps that man had deserved what he got. Perhaps another man could be born from the ashes. For now there was work still to do. The last lawsuits had to be closed, reputations mended, promises honored. There would be settlements and apologies, and the terrible arithmetic of restitution. There would also be ghosts, the image of my son on his knees, Ijioma's haunted silence on the balcony, Amaka's retreat into winter rain. But as I walked away from the mansion, my cane tapping a slow, measured beat, I felt something I hadn't felt for a long time. It was not triumph. It was not peace. It was a readiness to face whatever remained, even if what remained was the knowledge that some acts, once committed, become permanent ink on the paper of your soul. The reckoning had been made. The price had been paid. And in the quiet that followed, I understood something cruel and true. Revenge can win battles, but it asks you to carry the memory of them forever. The city had found a rhythm again, a careful, pragmatic tempo that comes after storms. Markets reopened, boardrooms filled, and men who had once whispered my name with contempt now nodded when I passed. My reputation, like a patched mast, held once more against the wind. I had rebuilt enough to be feared. I had repaired enough to be respected. The scorched places in my life were not gone, only disguised beneath paint and polite conversation. And yet, in the quiet hours, the ones that do not show up in newspapers or at cocktail parties, a different reality lived at my gate. Chuka's boys ran through the compound like any children do, small, loud, indestructible. They chased each other in the dust, their laughter ricocheting off the walls I had built. They called me Grandpa with the easy affection of the young. Their syllables landed like soft stones in a pond, creating ripples I could not stop. There are moments when a man knows he should feel only tenderness, and yet finds his chest knotted with something else. Irony sharpened into pain. Watching them, I felt that strange, cold tug. Not guilt, not quite. My conscience did not tremble much these days. But a deeper murmur. Questions that had no neat answers. People assume revenge is a clear equation. You take, they suffer. You punish, they repent. Life, however, writes in margins. It keeps footnotes that time rarely erases. I had taken what was mine back. I had seen the fall of a boy who had become a thief of legacies. I had used law and cunning and the patience of a man who had weathered worse. Yet somewhere amid the victories, I had crossed a threshold I had not anticipated. I remember the nights with Ijeoma like a series of dangerous glass plates. They caught light and cut fingers. There was consolation in one another's company. Yes, two wounded people piecing comfort from the same ragged cloth. But there was also an uglier consequence, the kind that blossoms when grief and revenge mix too freely. We were two architects of ruin in our way, she because she had been crushed and sought shelter, I because I had taught myself to use whatever means the world offered to set the ledger straight. People imagine confessions happen in courtrooms or at bedsides when one lies ablaze with remorse. My confession, if it could be called that, sat quiet and dense inside me. It lived in the shape of a question. Do I tell Chuka to run a DNA test on his boys? The question was a strange, obscene thing to set on a kitchen table and stare at. In private, I played it out like a chess problem. Tell him, watch his empire of humiliation collapse further under the weight of paternity doubt. Keep silent, carry the secret like a ledger entry only I could read. I tried to make this an intellectual exercise. I catalogued the consequences as if they were business projections. If I told him, then what? He would crumble, perhaps, and the children would be swept into a scandal that would spill beyond our family, into the tabloids and the lives of innocents. He might react with rage and fight back in ways that would harm those very boys. Or he might welcome the truth and begin the slow, painful work of making amends. There was no model for what would happen if I admitted I had crossed the most private of lines with his wife. There were only probabilities, each uglier than the last. I thought of the boys' faces, the roundness of their cheeks, the way one of them smiled with a half-smile I had seen in the mirror. It is a strange and petty thing to notice. Resemblance. And yet resemblance is the most insistent of reminders. It suggests continuity where perhaps none exists. It pulls at the old animal part of a man that measures legacy in features and name. I imagined Chuka's face, already a map of arrogance softened with defeat, contorting into a new geometry, shock, shame, rage, disbelief. I imagined him insisting on tests, on blood, on proof, and that image steeled me as much as it terrified me. There are nights when I would sit on the veranda watching those boys sleep. Ragged breaths, the small rise and fall of chests, toys strewn like confessions on the carpet. I remembered lifting Chuka as a boy onto my shoulder, feeling his small fingers grip my hair, trusting the world into my hands. I asked myself, in the small hours, whether I had undone that trust irrevocably. Had my retribution been a necessary purging, or an irredeemable mutilation of the family? I had told myself vengeance was justice for the many who suffered under Chuka's arrogance. Yet here, in the soft hush of the compound at night, I could see the faces of the innocent, and the arithmetic of harm shifted. Amaka was gone, washed away into a life that suited exile, expensive, lonely, and far. Chuka was diminished, but not dead in spirit. He moved in losses that had hollowed his confidence, but preserved his capacity for anger. Ijeoma stayed, though the way she moved through the house was quieter now, as if she bore the weight of what had been done and was still doing penance for it in small ways. Sometimes she looked at me and I saw gratitude mingled with the ghost of something like accusation. It was a complicated face, and I had learned that complicated faces are where truth sleeps. Once, in a rare fit of ill discipline, I almost told him. I had stood with Chuka on neutral ground, a small cafe where the staff pretended not to know the story and the coffee came thick and hot. He was talkative that day, trying awkward conversation like a man who wanted reconciliation, but didn't know the language of it. He laughed at something trivial, and for a moment the boy I had adored returned with a shout. The urge to strike that scene with the revelation was blunt and immediate. I pictured the look on his face and felt a surge of something like triumph. But then his youngest ran into the cafe, sticky hands, juice on his chin, and launched himself at his father. Chuka scooped him up, and the child burrowed into his neck with a trust that was implacable. Those 2 moments, father and child, held a power I could not dismantle with a word, not in that sunlit place. I put the truth back in my pocket as if it were something fragile and dangerous. I told myself I had chosen restraint, not for pity but for mercy. The word sounded oddly noble in my head. Silence, I realized, is not a neutral act. Keeping quiet is choosing an outcome as surely as speaking is. I had learned that in business. To not disclose is to shape the market. Here, in the unnatural markets of the heart, my silence had bought a peculiar peace. The boys' laughter continued. The routine of the compound held. Chuka mended himself in public but remained raw in private. He believed, at least for now, that he had dealt the final blow and that the universe had been remade according to his will. That illusion protected him. It protected the children. Protection. Odd word to use for what I did, but to tell would be to expose them to the tornado of public curiosity and private vengeance. Children do not choose the sins of their parents. They inherit, yes, but they do not deserve to be torn apart by the suits and cameras of judgment. My silence was paternal in its own way, a grotesque protectorate. I would hold the secret and thus spare them whatever storm might come. Perhaps that was my last shred of conscience, an old man's attempt to do less harm than he had already done. I began to measure my days by small acts of atonement I could not admit to myself as such. I paid school fees quietly, arranged for tutors, visited the pediatrician if a cough lingered. I left envelopes by the nanny's room, no name attached. It was a crude accounting system, but it kept me from collapsing into the private chaos of confession. I was buying time, not for myself, necessarily, but for the boys who ran like sunbeams across my compound. And yet, the question never fully left, when and if should truth be told? The honest answer might be never, unless necessary. The moralist within me wanted to argue otherwise, to say truth is a cleansing fire. But truth can scorch as well as purify. I had watched what honesty had done to reputations, livelihoods, and fragile human hearts. I had seen the children of other scandals become casualties. Would I, now that I held such power, choose to create another battlefield? There are nights when the boys' laughter seems almost sacrilegious, a sound that mocks my ledger and whispers that life stubbornly continues. I can stand at my gate and watch them without letting myself become a man again who acts on every surge of feeling. I am older, or perhaps just more weary. I have become a man who understands that some victories are cheap, some truths are weapons, and some silences are mercies. So I say nothing. For now. Perhaps one day I will speak. Perhaps the world will force my hand in a manner I cannot foresee, or perhaps I will carry the secret to my grave, another old ledger closed and heavy. Either way, the boys will grow into men marked by histories they did not write. They will make choices of their own. They will be, as all of us are, a combination of inheritance and will. Tonight, the smallest one has fallen asleep with a toy truck on his chest. His breath is steady. The other is dreaming at the end of the corridor, murmuring in a language of childhood. I move through the house like a shadow who keeps watch, feeling both predator and protector. I am a man who took back a life and found the price of doing so inscribed in the small faces that remind him of what he once loved. Bloodlines are not simple ledgers. They are messy, stubborn things that refuse to be reduced. I have chosen silence for now, and in that silence I keep a complicated, fragile guard. For now.